Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. So before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So the campus of Lewis and Clark College occupies the historic homelands of several indigenous groups. These groups include bands of the Chinook-speaking peoples, including the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala bands, as well as the Tualatin Kalapuya and the Molalla people in the Willamette Valley. Today, the descendants of these indigenous groups are primarily members of the Grand Ronde and the Siletz Confederated Tribes, with Chinook and other tribal relations at Warm Springs, Yakima, and the Chinook Nation. There are also many indigenous groups that remain unrecognized by the federal government, and their stories still demand and deserve to be heard. Our institution chooses to honor Lewis and Clark, two colonizers, instead of the many indigenous peoples that this land was taken from. We ask that you take some time to recognize whose land you are currently occupying and the necessity to return native land, strengthen indigenous sovereignty, and heal relationships with native nations. With this in mind, we urge you to pick up a flyer from our table outside with information about federal recognition for the Chinook Nation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Cameron Kolopsis. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a sociology and anthropology major here. And welcome to our first keynote event of our 43rd Annual Gender Studies Symposium. This year's symposium, being online, explores the ways in which digital technologies, internet platforms, and online spaces shape and are shaped by our understandings and expressions of gender and sexuality. The events this year explore the intersections of gender, sexuality, and digital technologies through conversations about work, leisure, sex, violence, family, privacy, activism, self-expression, and much more.
Good evening, everyone. My name is August Van Nieuwenhuizen. I use he, they pronouns. I'm a biology major, gender studies minor, and also one of this year's co-chairs. Tonight, alongside my co-chairs Cameron and Molly Gibbons, we are overjoyed to present to you a keynote presentation by Dr. Avery Dame-Griff titled When It Was Ours, A Queer and Trans Counterhistory of the Internet. Before the event begins, we have a few housekeeping announcements.
We want to remind you that we have a full schedule of events lined up for both tomorrow and Friday. Make sure you check out our website for details about all of the events, including panels, workshops, readings, and more. Please note that registration is required for the community dialogue session and the Art for Social Change Open Studio. You can find registration links on our website. We'd also like to remind you to visit our student-curated art exhibit in the Watsek Library Atrium. We'll host a reception celebrating the art exhibit next week on Tuesday, March 12th at 3:30, and the exhibit will remain on display until the end of the month. We also have a virtual gallery, which can be accessed via the link on the Symposium website and our Instagram page. Speaking of, we encourage you to follow our Symposium Instagram account at LCGenderSymp, where we'll be posting photos from this year's events. And this year we are hosting a raffle drawing each day. For each event you attend, you can submit one entry for a chance to win a copy of a book written by one of our phenomenal keynote speakers. Tonight's prize is Avery Dame-Griff's book, The Two Revolutions. If you still have a ticket to turn in, please raise your hand, and somebody can come collect your ticket, and we'll come and draw the winner. Does nobody have a ticket? Perfect. You guys are doing great. Okay, so the rule is you have to be here to win, so if nobody claims it, we draw again. And so we're going to announce the winner now. We ask that you stay, you identify yourself, and you come speak with Kim over here at the end of the Q&A tonight to get your prize. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm reading the number 5958649. Okay, no. Well, I'll give you all a second. My bad.
There is also a name on the website.
It's a pronouncement later. I can read the name. instead, as that's easier. Sophie Levine. Is Sophie Levine here? Okay, so come see Kim. Come see Kim at the end of the Q&A to get your prize. Thank you. I guess, okay, that's it. Oh, also, sorry, if you were not the winner, if you were not Sophie Levine, you can also, the book will be available for purchase at the reception foyer after the Q&A.
Awesome. Congratulations, Sophie. Final reminder, please remember that private recordings and photos of this event are not permitted. Photos from this year's Gender Studies Symposium will be posted on our social media platforms next week. This keynote event is also being recorded and will be made available on the Gender Studies Symposium website as soon as possible. And there will be time for questions and discussion following the conclusion of the presentation. As you listen to the presentation, we encourage you to write down notes, ideas, or questions. Cameron and I, along with our fellow co-chair Molly, are delighted to have Dr. Avery Dame-Griff joining us for this year's symposium. Dr. Dame-Griff is a lecturer in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Gonzaga University. His interdisciplinary research considers the long-term impact digital technologies have on social movement organizing and political activism. His first book, The Two Revolutions, A History of the Transgender Internet, explores how the rise of the internet transformed transgender social and political organizing from the 1980s to the contemporary moment. That book will be available for purchase, as we said, in the reception following the presentation. When considering who we wanted to invite to this symposium, we are drawn to Dr. Avery Dame-Griff and his work as it explores the digital world in relation to gender, sexuality, and community. Dr. Dame-Griff's work highlights this complex reciprocity of digital spaces. Like when he says in his book, just as the current trans movement wouldn't exist in its current form without the internet was inescapably shaped by the presence of trans users. Similarly, trans youth and adults who are coming out now continue to face challenges online that echo earlier revolutionary struggles. In addition to his teaching and writing, Dr. Dame-Griff is the founder and primary curator of the Queer Digital History Project, an independent community history project cataloging and archiving pre-2010 LGBTQ+ spaces online. The QDHP has many extensive ongoing projects, such as the Read Write Memories Oral History Collection, dedicated to documenting queer oral histories of the early digital age. In 2022, Dr. Dame-Griff was selected to be a Public Humanities Fellow for Humanities Washington, developing a series of interactive online exhibits, teaching guides, and workshops about the history of LGBTQ+ communities and online spaces. We hope Dr. Dame-Griff's talk places the poorly understood role of technology in queer and trans social movements in a historical and ever-relevant present political context. We invite you to use this newfound understanding of the digital past to imagine ways our ever-changing digital worlds can be used to create a better reality for all users and all people, but most especially those experiencing ongoing and shifting forms of digital oppression. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Avery Dame-Griff.
Thank you for having me. If only my students were this excited to see me at the front of a stage. So, like I said, after that lovely introduction, I will just go ahead and get us started. Alrighty. And I also want to say thank you to the organizers and to Kim, because I am amazed how well it runs. This seems to run like a well-oiled machine. I'm very impressed. It's an amazing amount of work, because I know how much it is to get all these pieces together. It's a lot of work, so I'm really impressed. All right. So, I'm going to begin this talk, before we kind of get into the meat of it, I'm going to begin it with me. So, when I grew up, there were always two computers in our house. There was one for my father, which he used for his jobs as a systems administrator, and all of his hand-me-downs, which are what I got. So you could see a photo of one of those from 1995 here. This is not exactly a top-of-the-line computer, but for a 7-year-old in 1995, this is a pretty nice setup. And because of the nature of my father's job, we also had a home internet connection much earlier than many of my peers. I have these memories of us sitting side by side on weekend nights. He is working on an issue with the server for work, while I am chatting with strangers online. So if you used enough early text chat, you become used to answering the same question over and over and over. ASL, or age, sex, location. Now it would more accurately be AGL for age, gender, and location. So in my moment of answering this question over and over, as I was probably like 10 maybe, I experienced a new realization. I could lie. I never lied outright because I was nothing if not a consummate rule follower as a kid, but the ability to lie by omission about my gender was a practice I would engage in repeatedly throughout my early years online. I would want people to assume I was male, even if I didn't identify that way in my offline life. And looking back, this practice fits with my larger trans experience, using the internet as a way to express masculinity outside of offline spaces, where I didn't feel safe exploring it. And so when I came out in Alabama when I went to college in late 2006, I didn't know any trans people in my daily life. Instead, I connected through trans-specific groups online, and I relied on digital guides to find local resources. So mine is just one anecdotal example, but it represents some of the ways LGBTQ individuals benefited from digital communications. And though I didn't know it at the time, LGBTQ individuals had been connecting via computer since the early 1980s, long before I was chatting away. They'd been building vibrant social networks, sharing resources, and engaging in digital activism. Yet, for folks who weren't active at the time, these communities' names, like the Mail Forum, CompuWho, Cross Connection, or the Backroom, for example, they have no meaning. But for members of these spaces, they represent so much more. The first place they might have felt comfortable asking the question to themselves, am I gay? Monthly meetups with lifelong friends now, where you found the shoulder to cry on when yet another friend or lover passed away. And in many cases, these were spaces wholly owned and operated by and for queer and trans folks. They were, with all of their many imperfections, ours. So in this talk, I'm actually going to explore the history of 3 such LGBTQ communities from the early years of digital life: 28 Barbary Lane, Multicom 4, and the Gay and Lesbian Information Bureau, or GLIB. And all of these go back even before most Americans had heard of the internet. Each of these stories represents a road not taken, what could have happened but didn't. These communities don't easily fit into the popular narrative of the internet, which emphasizes early government-funded networks and then the later dominance of venture capital-funded Silicon Valley corporations, both before and after the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s. I'll note, I don't tell these stories to idealize a different kind of past, though. Much like a lot of other digital spaces at the time, the population of LGBTQ digital spaces tended to be middle class, male, and white. Yet their designers and users, how they imagined what digital communications could do and be as a new way to build community, first and foremost. Not extracting profit, that, I think, is what we can take away from it. So by redirecting our attention toward these seemingly forgotten histories, I argue we can identify a blueprint for how to get beyond dominant ideology, and you'll hear this term a couple times, to imagine otherwise. Imagine a digital world that ensures those community members who have the least access or are most often silenced have a voice. Now, for each of these histories, for this one, I'm actually, ironically, not going to begin online, but I'm going to start with an older medium. So we'll begin with the story of Robin, whose love affair, as she describes it, with computers and online communities begins in an unexpected place: books. So her first exposure to computers comes in 1986. An X's microcomputer, as she says, a sort of strange off-brand computer purchased by mail order, I think, that my ex never used and I only tinkered around with a bit. A few years later, she acquired a TRS-80, which, despite her best intentions, did not prompt her to write, as she says, the great American novel. Instead, it just kind of sat there, gathering dust. But then in 1991, she encounters a novel that would transform how she thought about computers. Sandra Scopatone's detective novel, Everything You Have Is Mine. So in it, lesbian PI Lauren Lorano delves into the world of bulletin board systems to solve a string of murders. While Lorano begins the novel a total computer novice, she quickly becomes an addict, staying up all hours to play games, chat with other users, and trawl the straight computer dating boards to flesh out a killer. Yes, those existed in the 80s. In the process, developing a permanent case of what her girlfriend dubs modem hair. Also, just to get a reference to the 80s, when we're talking about GIFs, this is what you think it is. It's just they were not high quality in the 80s. So Scopatone's detailed descriptions of using bulletin board systems fascinated Robin, but she didn't have access to an adequate computer setup until 1992, when she convinced her then partner, it's a new partner, to invest in a new desktop computer and modem. While this was ostensibly to support her ongoing job hunt, because she'd been recently laid off, she really had some less legitimate reasons. She really wanted to get onto a bulletin board system. Yet when it came time to pick one to connect to from the list of hundreds in the Seattle area, she didn't know how to choose. Until she saw a name she recognized from another queer-themed book she'd actually just finished reading, 28 Barbary Lane, the address of the boarding house at the center of Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. It was, to her, fate. And she wasn't the only LGBTQ individual to log on. 28 Barbary Lane, or 28 BBL, as it was more commonly known, was one of the most popular BBSs in Seattle. By 1990, it had over 1,000 registered members, and it regularly ranked in the industry magazine Boardwatch's annual reader poll for overall best BBS, as well as being voted the best bulletin board system, or BBS, in Washington State, which is a pretty impressive feat for a gay and lesbian BBS. However, before we get into this specifically, I've used this term a lot. I'm going to explain what exactly is a bulletin board system. So, this is a photo of a very small BBS here. As you can tell, it's just you got one computer, you got a modem, and you got some associated equipment, like external hard drives. So, bulletin board systems, or BBSs, were some of the first publicly available ways folks communicated using a modem and a computer. So this graphic lays out the basic process. Using your modem, you call the BBS's phone number. It connects you to the BBS's modem located on the other end of that phone line, and if it's available, you log in. It's important to note here that given the technical realities of BBSing, most regular users of a bulletin board system lived within its immediate area code, since calling a BBS long distance could get quite pricey the longer you stayed on the line. This is an experience I suspect many of you have never had, since you no longer have landlines. So at its core, the BBS is basically just a server that you can log into and has lots of different functions. You can chat, you can send and receive email, you can access files they host, you can play games. Basically, in some ways, it's the very first form of social media. So this is a screen for a modern BBS that's run by a vintage computing enthusiast. So 28 Barbary Lane was founded in March 1985 by Sysop J.D. Brown, who was inspired by his encounters using bulletin board systems, which he'd initially sought out as an alternative to the local bar scene. Brown, who quite evocatively described his early days using BBSs as better than an inflatable companion for sex, He really said that. Hope to create a space where other users could find resources and have a similarly positive experience. However, in 1985, the BBS is still a relatively new technology, and it could have a really steep learning curve, as Brown knew from his own process. So in a 1990 interview, he admitted to the Seattle Gay News that he needed the help of a technologically savvy 15-year-old punk rocker just to get 28BBL up and running. So the way he made this technology approachable was using the frame of 28 Barbary Lane from Tales of the City, essentially as an analogy for how to transform this flat digital file structure into a more comprehensible 3D space for new users. Brown named each of the board's forums after different spaces in Maupin's boarding house in the novel series, as well as a few others. And without even knowing their contents, which are in parentheses on this list up here, the titles roughly make each forum's purpose clear. It's also worth noting users reconfigured existing community terminology to reflect the different ways they were using their bodies. So in the bedroom, as you can see, that is where you go cruising. Users looking for a good time weren't engaging in S&M, which was a bar scene term at the time for, excuse my pose, standing and modeling. But they called it sitting and modeming. And variants on this boarding house art would welcome users to the board throughout its lifetime, visually reinforcing the sense of this bustling, active home, where Mrs. Madrigal, who essentially ran the boarding house in the novel, where she's standing by to welcome you. So this use of tales as a spatial framing device continues even as the board expanded. Unsurprisingly, 28BBL's user base was male-dominated, at an estimated ratio of 7 members who identified as men for every 1 who identified as a woman. So in 1990, the Womenwood Forum was created as a women-only space. The forum's name was a reference to a women-only festival modeled on the Michigan Women's Music Festival in Maupin's 1987 novel in the Tales series Significant Others. So as the SysOp, or systems operator, that's sort of the term they use, you can substitute administrator for that. So as SysOp, Brown was landlady of the Bulletin Boarding House, as the Seattle Gay News put it. So in this role, he welcomed new members. He offered a safe ear. He settled disputes amongst tenants and did the house cleaning needed to keep the system running. Adopting the Miss Madrigal username, or handle, in BBS vocabulary, allowed him to transpose the fictional character's ethos, which Maupin at one point has a character in the novel describe her as, quote, a landlady of almost cosmic sensitivity. He can transpose that onto himself. And cultivating member trust was particularly important, given the board's topical focus. Users who had, as they put it, homosexual curiosity, relied on the board's anonymity to protect their identity. As SysOp, only Brown and those who would follow him in the role had access to not just every message and interaction, but members' private information, which could be used against them. Yet they felt safe knowing only Madrigal could enter their room. And once the homosexually curious, so to speak, felt ready to expand their horizons beyond the digital confines of 28BBL, they could attend one of the regular meetups 28BBL's SysOps sponsored for board members, where they could socialize, they could meet face-to-face, they could meet some hunks in Speedos, apparently. And beyond just getting to know each other, these events were also sometimes fundraising opportunities for local LGBTQ nonprofits, like at the time in 1993, Hands Off Washington, which was an advocacy group dedicated to fighting anti-LGBTQ ballot initiatives in Washington state. So by meeting in this physical space, 28BBL becomes a visible part of the local community. Though I haven't been able to track down photos, there's record that an official contingent from the board marched in the 1993 Seattle Pride Parade. It's worth noting these meetups also shaped how regular users thought about their audience when posting. It's one thing to get in a flame war on a digital forum, but it's another when those who are burned by your insults might be attending an in-person board event. You might think about shouting at someone on the internet differently when you're standing next to them at the bar. On the flip side, these online connections could transition to offline friendships or even romance. So these two listings from the Seattle Gay News are just two examples. So in the only oral history I've done so far with a 28 BBL regular, she compared her relative comfort calling up a friend she'd made via BBS to hang out versus her experience in Facebook groups for queer women of color in Seattle, whereas she'd felt totally comfortable taking a 4-hour car ride with someone she'd only met via 28 BBL, a thing that appalled her non-computer using sister at the time. She said she could never imagine doing the same thing with someone she'd met via Facebook. Yet even with all this getting along, conflict between members was still inevitable. As we can see from the quote here, we now have all been on the internet for a long time. We know that people like to yell at each other. And while some users, like Reform Schoolgirl, as her handle, considered themselves, quote, verbal exhibitionists who didn't mind healthy debate, other member conflicts could really devolve into insults and flaming, necessitating the sysop to step in and moderate. Unlike a contemporary platform, though, where moderation decisions can seem to be at the whim of an unnamed faceless corporation, if they're even now made with a human in the loop at all, the architecture of the BBS meant that the ultimate authority lay with the sysop, who was far from faceless. Most members had some sense of who the sysop was, from a passing familiarity to an ongoing social relationship. So when issues amongst members arose, they had the ability to reach out to the sysop directly, as implied in this example from a 1992 Seattle Gay News piece. It wasn't unheard of for a board's sysop to pick up their home phone line only to immediately get an earful from an aggrieved BBS user. In these interactions, they can try and persuade the sysop to change their mind that the behavior was justified, or in the case of Truth Hurts Bigots, they can get inventive with their handle to indirectly chastise their critics. There's a lot of freedom and flexibility here in some ways. And even though the sysop is also notably technically the ultimate authority of a BBS, the number of interactions as a BBS grows, they require oversight that extends well beyond what one human can manage, necessitating the appointment of volunteer moderators. So, on 28 BBL, one of the first fora to have a volunteer moderator appointed was in Womenwood in 1991. So the reasoning behind this move was twofold. Jeff Thompson, who had taken over for Brown in 1990, he could no longer manage to moderate every forum on 28 BBL, but he was also uncomfortable with the idea of a man as the final authority in what was ostensibly a women-only space. So the appointment of Bailey is the user who steps in to moderate. The appointment of Bailey represents how the BBS's affordances, they allow sysops to share governing power, ensuring women had the agency to both moderate and set policy over their forum. It's also worth noting, speaking of policy, the irony of a forum named after a fictional take on Michigan Women's Music Festival debating the place of transsexual lesbians in women-only space in the early 1990s is definitely not lost on me, and I suspect they're very closely related given the timing. As you can see, we never lose some things. They always come back. It's worth noting the women-identified users of 28 BBL use the space of Womenwood to also invent a novel form of offline protest to be enacted beyond the bounds of the board, the tavern takeover. So in mid-1991, Womenwood users were engaged in an ongoing community debate over whether local bars and taverns were welcoming to women. They were also had the seemingly eternal concern that all of the lesbian bars kept closing for some reason. So in response to all of this, a Womenwood user, Vanilla Dyke, she leveraged the BBS's reach to connect this large network of queer women, some of whom likely had no social connection outside of 28 Barbary Lane, to organize what she called Operation Tavern Storm, a one-night takeover of the local gay nightclub Neighbors. So users focused on Neighbors in particular based on the visual and textual rhetoric of their advertising, as you can see here. You've got the language where men are free to be who they are. And art evoking the work of hyper-masculine gay artist Tom of Finland. I would not suggesting, if you don't know who that is, don't Google it just yet. It's lovely, just don't Google it. Anyway, so as a political tactic, the takeover represents a literal embodied argument. By occupying Neighbors with their bodies, the participants of Operation Tavern Storm are saying, we're here, we're queer, we're ready to buy beer. Why won't you serve us too? And in her article on the campaign, and this is quotes from that, author Barbara Sayre, she draws clear parallels between other kinds of embodied protest actions, like Take Back the Night rallies, with Operation Tavern Storm. And according to Sayre's coverage, more than 100 women participated, and an, quote, air of sisterly joviality pervaded throughout the night. And as she says, the impact of this, as she saw it, would be felt long after. So the sense of safety and belonging were also a defining aspect of the Rochester, New York-based gay and lesbian BBS Multicom 4. However, Multicom 4 didn't actually begin life as a gay and lesbian BBS. So Multicom 4 founder Chaz Antonelli, he first launched his BBS, initially named Cactus 800, as you can see here, in 1979 on an Atari 800 in his bedroom. It was available from the moment he got home from middle school to when he went to bed. So over time, as he got older, this evolved into Multicom 1, which he ran throughout the 1980s. First out of the computer shop where he worked. And in fact, when he described it to me, it was sitting in the middle of the shop. So prospective shoppers would come in, and as he said, they'd look at this thing humming away, and they'd hear all the calls coming in. And it was this kind of attractant. Later on, it would sort of become his unofficial roommate, following him from apartment to apartment while he finished his undergraduate degree. And like most roommates, it often failed to pay for its part of the electric bill, and it kept Antonelli up at night working through its various issues. However, his dedication to it never wavered. As Antonelli tells it, the BBS's evolution mirrored his own coming out. So he first opened a private gay and lesbian sub-BBS, CitySys, so CITYSIS, on what had now become Multicom 2 in 1985. It attracted about 70 users, which was good for the time, but not great. So a year and one major software upgrade later, though, Antonelli had transformed the board's identity overnight. Regular callers were greeted with a new name, Multicom 3, and a login screen with an upside-down triangle and a new tagline, Rochester's first gay bulletin board system. In fact, Antonelli thinks it was probably the first in upstate New York. And you can see an ad for it over here down on the right. So the board would eventually evolve into its final form, Multicom 4. Throughout its life, Multicom 4 offered a variety of forums, from active chat rooms and spaces to safely come out, to sponsored forums for local community groups, such as AIDS Rochester, or a forum for deaf LGBTQ folks. The text-based nature of the board was particularly meaningful in Rochester, which also happens to be the home for the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. It's attached to the Rochester Institute of Technology. So through the BBS, deaf, gay, and lesbian folks in Rochester who'd struggled to make connections to the local community were able to build long-lasting friendships through the BBS. And also, notably, one of the big attractions to the BBS was the ability to play games online against other BBS users. These were often simple, text-based affairs, but folks could get hooked. Even Antonelli wasn't spared. As he tells it, one of his lovers had become addicted to playing this game, Galactic Empire. I know now it looks very exciting. Where players are basically, they're competing to maintain the largest space empire. So he tells me this story when he's talking to me. One night at 3 o'clock, his lover at the time, he runs into the bedroom. He's like shaking Antonelli awake, and she's just shouting in his face, "You have to delete Gumby 2 right now! He keeps beating me!" And when Antonelli refuses, and so he cites his responsibility to treat all members impartially. He's like, "I can't do that. I can't just delete someone because you're losing." His lover did not take it well. He packed up his stuff and left. That was the end of that relationship. So as you can guess from these anecdotes, the most distinctive aspect of Multicom 4 were its members. They were, in Antonelli's telling, a dedicated group. They consistently attended the board's annual parties and barbecues, which served to strengthen their local connections and shared sense of community. At one barbecue, a member donated a limousine hood they'd spray painted with the board's distinctive logo, which is pictured here over on the right, with all ticket proceeds going to support the BBS. So in Antonelli's recounting, and he showed me a photo of this when we were talking, he didn't really think the hood was that much of a prize, but apparently the competition to win it got actually really fierce. In fact, as you can sort of see over here on the left, after the board closed, former members continued to have a weekly in-person meeting at a local Rochester coffee shop for most of the 2000s. So throughout Multicom 4's history, Antonelli resisted ever commercializing the board. And Multicom 4 fully incorporated as an official 501c3 509A nonprofit under the name Multicom Data Services in the 1990s. So Antonelli really thought of it as, using a member-centered model similar to public broadcasting in the US, framing it as first and foremost a community resource. All callers who called into the BBS had a set amount of free time, and folks paid in extra time via donations, like members. And in fact, he always used the term members to refer to users, because to him, it was these folks on the board who really kept Multicom 4 running. Also, as head of Multicom Data Services, Antonelli also accepted donated computer equipment, which he or volunteers would repair and at times redistribute for free to those who couldn't afford to purchase a computer system. And whenever members would run out of free hours, and if they couldn't afford to donate to pay for more, they could earn more by serving as on-call volunteer tech support for other folks, using this custom touchtone phone system Antonelli had rigged up. Notably, also, Multicom 4 maintained free public terminals in locations in both Rochester and Buffalo, New York, where prospective members could access areas of the board for free. And given a couple of these were in bars, frankly, they also kind of used it for pre-Grindr hookups. So as the board enters its late 1990s, Antonelli was surprised to find the proportion of non-LGBT folks using Multicom 4 was steadily increasing. But it wasn't because of any increased political awareness or allyship, though. No, it was because MC4 offered the fastest and most consistent internet connection in the region. The demand for internet had become so overwhelming that by 1999, MC4 had functionally shifted from being primarily a BBS to serving as a small community internet service provider. As an ISP, Multicom Data Services used their services for the community, offering free web hosting and server space to local organizations who didn't already have access to these services. And MC4 wasn't the only BBS to shift its focus toward the internet. This was also the case for GLIB, the Gay and Lesbian Information Bureau. So John Larimore founded GLIB in Washington, D.C. in 1986, following his own explorations of other bulletin board systems. Like Multicom 4, Glib was maintained by an incorporated nonprofit, Community Educational Services Foundation. From the beginning, Larimore emphasized the BBS as an information clearinghouse, a common space where folks could connect to other community groups in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Glib also maintained public terminals in 2 different gay and lesbian bookstores in Washington, D.C. And so Larimore had these great ideas that he would be providing all this information. Again, the idea is the name is the Information Bureau. But as humans, what folks really loved about the board, he found, was the social aspects, what he called the electronic cocktail party. And this is what was attracting members. Much like with 28 BBL and Multicom 4, the online and offline also blurred when members met for parties at Larimore's house, and they had a regular Friday night happy hour. In fact, Larimore tells this story that they would have this happy hour, and they would have it at different bars for a year, and then almost immediately after they stopped, the bar would close. He's like, we basically have killed 3 bars in the DC area by having our happy hour. And so beyond just kind of having all these social connections, it's worth knowing members could be politically involved. In 1993, President Clinton sent a letter of thanks to Glib's members for their work helping process constituent letters sent to the new administration, which in 1992 had received more mail than the entire tenure of the previous presidential administration. As Clinton said at the time, members' quote, computer expertise and dedication to and devotion to service were, quote, making a real contribution to the future of this nation. Very presidential stuff. So that same year, Glib ranked number 5 in BoardWatch's Top 100 Boards poll, which is a really rare feat given the prominence of non-community specific boards within the field. Mostly the stuff that ranked were the places that you could find possibly illegal software. And it would climb the ranks in 1994, and then the height, it would reach number 3. Yet members' devotion to service wasn't just for the nation, but to Glib, Larimore, and fellow members. Glib's maintenance was funded through donations and fundraisers, which could be so successful that Larimore found himself with excess donations, which he turned around and then donated to other local gay and lesbian organizations. But the most remarkable, I think in my case, of members' devotion came in 1994 when Larimore's partner John Maroney passed away from complications related to Cushing's disease. Known by his honorary titles Wicked Stepmother and Mrs. Sissop, Maroney had been a key figure in the BBS's history, often serving as its de facto party planner for their events. Even as Maroney joked that Larimore spent more time with his extramarital mistress, Glib, than with him, Maroney steadfastly supported Larimore's work. Following Maroney's initial hospitalization, members were quick to offer their support to Larimore, as well as to send cards and other gifts to the hospital. Even though Maroney couldn't access a computer, Larimore made sure to take, quote, a printout of all the kind thoughts sent his way on Glib, which Larimore said really brightened his evening, that'd be Maroney. And Maroney had asked me to thank you all for your supportive good wishes. Maroney would pass away 5 days later. In his announcement post, "We've lost Mrs. Sissop," Larimore shared both the details of his memorial service and Maroney's final wish to be surrounded by, quote, a sea of flowers. As Larimore described it in an interview with Jason Scott in 2002, members sent so many flowers you could hardly get in the room for the viewing. In response to Larimore's post, members also took the opportunity to reflect on what Glib meant to them, as in this post from user Jeff, who saw the BBS as, quote, the basking glow to which many gay folk and myself have turned many times to warm ourselves against the chilly world out there. And regular Glibber Allison, Glibber was the term they sort of used for themselves, as did many others, emphasized in their notes to John Larimore that Glib was more than just a digital community, but a chosen family. In her view, Glib stood as a living memorial to Larimore and Moroni's years-long work, creating a space where members could find their chosen family when they had nowhere else to go. And for Larimore, not just Glib itself, but as he says here, the people who are Glib had, quote, literally kept me together during the past month following Moroni's death. It was, quote, all the other wonderful and very special people on Glib who made it more than just, quote, a piece of software running on an impersonal piece of hardware. In fact, Larimore was so touched that he publicly archived much of the correspondence around Moroni's death on his website, both as a memorial to Moroni and as, quote, an inspiration to others who lose their loved ones. So Glib's peak membership came around 1995, as more and more individuals were starting to seek out a new, more graphical medium, the internet. So in 1996, Larimore shifted focus to a new venture, a non-profit internet service provider, Zap. I don't know how to pronounce it with the exclamation point. So for first $9.95 and eventually $12.95 a month, subscribers got not just access to the internet, but access to email, web hosting, and a bunch of other similar associated services. By 1997, the funds from Zap had become the primary vehicle for both funding Community Educational Services Foundation and Glib. One of Zap's most unique features, though, was its 1 for 10 program. So for each 10 paying subscribers, Zap offered a free subscription to, quote, those in our community who suffer serious chronic health issues, financial constraints, or other personal challenges precluding even the modest Zap monthly subscription fee. So this commitment to community support was, in Larimore's view, a foundational aspect of the Zap customer, as you can see from this list from this page on their site, who not only, quote, believes in supporting nonprofit community services, but also in helping your neighbor who's less fortunate. And while there's no clear documentation on how many or what kind of individuals took advantage of the 1 for 10 program, given both Glib and the Community Educational Services Foundation's focus on gay and lesbian issues, it's likely that one of the serious chronic health issues at the forefront of Larimore's mind was people living with AIDS, for whom the internet might be one of the few ways they could access information and support from home. In this testimonial from Mick, which is the only current documentation I have for someone who used this program, is an example of what free internet access could mean for those with chronic health conditions. So as we review these three histories, there are some key themes that emerge. First, the importance of community. All of these bulletin board systems would be nothing without their committed core users. Second, there's strong local connections. Even though the BBS was a digital space, the board's culture was deeply informed and connected to its geographic location. And lastly, being for people, not for profit. All three of these bulletin board systems were either formally incorporated or informally acted as community-engaged nonprofits first and foremost. So, I've spent about the last half hour talking about bulletin board systems, but I'm curious. So I'm gonna take a little poll real quick. Satisfy my curiosity, maybe. How many of you before today had ever heard of a bulletin board system? Raise your hands. Oh, that's more than I thought. Now, my next question would be, how many of you have read my book? Okay, not as many. But if you hadn't, it doesn't surprise me, because the question comes with this: why hadn't you heard of them? What happened to them? Quite simply, the World Wide Web happened and transformed how folks communicated via computer. I love the cover of this book. It's the most aggressively late 90s thing on the planet. That cool backwards baseball cap, and he's surfing on a keyboard. Anyway. So websites didn't have the same limitations as a bulletin board system, and they totally upended the economics of digital communications. BBSs were always more focused on social communication and community building, and it was notoriously impossible to really make a living off running a BBS. The folks who did it in the oldest way you ever make money off the internet, and I'm going to leave that up to your imagination. So, as you can see here in this chart from Kevin Driscoll's book, The Modem World, which is a history of the bulletin board system that came out last year, the number of active BBSs began to decline sharply in 1995, and this trend accelerates throughout the end of the 1990s. 28 Barbary Lane held on for a few more years, but it appears to have closed sometime in 1997 to 1998. So in contrast to bulletin board systems, websites and the early web seemed like nothing but one money-making opportunity after another. Commerce was the driving force behind adoption of the internet once the visual web browser became accessible to a wide audience with the release of Netscape, which you can see a screenshot of one of the early versions here, in 1994. And this emphasis on the internet as a primarily transactional space only increases after the dot-com crash in 2000. The bulletin board systems that did stay active supported their existence by, as we've seen, transitioning from primarily being a bulletin board system to being an internet service provider, or ISP, that just happened to also have a BBS kind of grafted onto it. This was the route, as we saw, for both Multicom 4 and Glib. Even then, however, both of these organizations were non-profits first and foremost, and this is reflected in their community-oriented approach to providing internet access. Both of them offered different ways for those in the community who couldn't afford the price of connection, ways to get online. That's certainly not the case now when you're lucky if you have more than 2 hated mega conglomerates to choose from for your internet access. I should have put Quantum up here because I think Quantum's local. But unlike when the bulletin board system being replaced by new technology, this time the end of the burgeoning nonprofit ISPs that these boards had turned into, their end was all about economics. So to explain this, I'm actually going to return us briefly to the story of Multicom 4. So I end talking about it with a shift toward providing internet access in the late 1990s. And by Antonelli's account, Multicom 4 was doing a decent business, enough that they needed to move out of their existing location in the back of his leather goods store into a newer, larger space. So as part of this move, Antonelli convinced his new skeptical landlord to invest in laying high-end fiber optic cable to the building, on the grounds that it would attract new tenants. Not long after the move, though, Antonelli noticed that Multicom 4 had a new neighbor in the building, an America Online server node. As Antonelli recounts it, that was the moment he knew Multicom 4's days were numbered. Simply put, they wouldn't be able to survive the competition of what had become a mammoth internet service provider like AOL, who no doubt hoped to take advantage of the very infrastructure he'd worked so hard to get from Multicom 4. Zap faced a similar fate, driven out of business by their inability to take advantage of new, all-digital infrastructures controlled by large corporations. So far, this sounds like a parade of sad stories, right? We have 3 really interesting digital LGBTQ spaces, once important pillars in their communities, now largely lost to public memory. However, I think these can also be understood as hopeful if we think about them differently, not as failures, but evidence of possibility. So in her article, Feminist Theories of Technology, feminist science and technology scholar Judy Wiseman makes a point to note that, as quote up here, technologies are not the inevitable result of the application of scientific and technological knowledge. And people and artifacts co-evolve, reminding us that things could be otherwise. And as Black queer studies scholar Ashton Crawley argues in his essay, Otherwise Ferguson, The politics of otherwise represents, quote, the disbelief in what is current and a movement towards and an affirmation of imagining other modes of social organization, other ways for us to be with each other. In these three stories, I see the roads not taken at the time, digital social platforms grounded in their local context, communities with a real commitment to shared governance, and ISPs focused not just on economic gain, but on giving back. I see a digital space that was, for lack of a better way to put it, ours. And like the mid-1990s, we're currently in a moment of possibility for digital communities. Individuals' internet experience since the mid-2000s has been dominated by large, centralized platforms like Twitter, Facebook, or TikTok. With that comes market-friendly approaches to communication, which can have disastrous consequences for LGBTQ individuals, as you can see from these three headlines here. I suspect some of the people in this room might have experienced some of this. Now, I am not telling you to go out and start your own BBS. I mean, that would be cool, and I would totally log on, but that's not very realistic. But I'd argue that we can and should start looking for a future beyond what corporate platforms provide. New possibilities are arising with renewed interest in decentralized platforms. I don't know why I said it like that. Decentralized platforms that rely on open protocols, such as Mastodon's ActivityPub protocol and Blue Sky's AT protocol. These are things that no one corporate entity could fully control. And even if these two things don't become the foundation of the next 20 years of the internet, it's important to not let our imaginations be yoked to the driving impulses of late-stage capitalism. Knowing these roads not taken can inspire us to think otherwise, to imagine other ways for us to be with each other online, to return to a time when we would go to a place, talk to the people, and know without a doubt that it was ours. Thank you. Do you want me to do the... So I guess we'll be open. It says questions for Q&A. I'll also note, I meant to say at the beginning, I didn't talk about anything mostly in my book, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. You want to start over and move up? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Madeline. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to Lewis and Clark. I really appreciated hearing your talk. It was really informative, especially learning more about modems, which no longer are a thing that exists. So I'll be giving my dad some recommendations. But a lot of the new modern platforms that you were referencing at the end of your talk don't really model the forum board style of BBS. And I was curious if you could speak to more contemporary, like LGBTQ plus forum boards that still have that like text-based, like reply thread format. And yeah.
That is a very good question. And the reason I'm pausing and thinking is because like, one of the things that's interesting is it's a very good question, but it's also like a part of when you move away from a corporate platform. This is a thing that you would see with BBSs too. Everyone is their own distinct culture. And so as you develop different cultures, you can see the ways in which some can be more text-oriented, some will be less text-oriented. And so this is one of the difficulties of persuading someone to, say, move to Mastodon, which in some cases can be correctly described as a bunch of white dudes who want to yell at you about Linux. It doesn't have to be, though, but it depends on where you go. And that's one of the things I think about. I know I'm sort of like, I don't have any individual recommendations, But what I can say is this is one of the things that is great about the idea of decentralization is if you can pick where server you are, and that can have its own culture. And so if that culture is very heavily text-based, you'll be getting a very similar experience, possibly. It'll be more about, like, in some ways it's like going to a restaurant and there's 5 things on the menu, and then going to a buffet that is clean, going to the buffet and being like, I have 30 choices, and I get to pick what I choose. For a long time, we've been stuck with the menu, and I'm like, I would like for everyone to get to have the buffet, and then maybe you can find that. So yeah, I don't have any specific recommendations off the top of my head, but I think I will say, like, I think it's possible, certainly. Because I can think of platforms that started out like that, even say, oh God, there's that Instagram account that became a lesbian dating app. Lex, yes, where Lex starts out like this, and now Lex is essentially sort of like venture capital-y. And like that's the thing of like, how do we move away from this, like, how do we make money? Fast track into turning into an app. So yeah, that is, I want that possibly exist. I can't think of anything off my head because anything I think of is sort of like, it's like, well, how do we make money? We turn into the thing that's successful. So I hope that helped. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Ooh. My name's Josie. I'm a queer history enthusiast. And so I just wanted to ask, doing research about online history can be difficult because it's anonymous or the websites go down. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you found sources for this and like people to interview, despite the like wall of onlineness.
Yeah, I think this is true. This is something I talk about in the book, but it's true here, is so much of often my sources would be, was something printed? Thank God, that meant someone saved it if it was on paper. So say for 28 BBL, a lot of that has been relying on the archives of Seattle Gay News because they describe it so extensively, relying on what has been archived in the Wayback Machine. But sometimes, not so much in this work, but a part of why like I'm doing these oral histories is to capture the memories, because what is left is what is in people's brains. In some cases, these folks are passing away. From what I know vaguely of John Larimer's age, I think he's 75 to 80. So I don't know how long he's got left. I hope he's got a long, healthy life. But I know folks like him from this era will be passing, and what's left is in their memories. So some of it is finding people and talking to people. And the joke I sometimes also say about doing this work is that I cold email elders, and I'm like, did you save all of those old computers in your basement? Because they're history now. Please don't throw them away. Because, I mean, that is sometimes what it is. It is, at one point, I was connected with Dallas Denny, who, if you know your trans history, was a very important activist throughout the 1990s and 2000s, ran a major information clearinghouse. And I was put in contact with her and was talking to her about getting some digital donations. And in the course of that email thread, she says to me, you know, maybe I've been meaning to, maybe I'll fire up my old Commodore 64 and see if there's still anything on it. There's like one vintage computer enthusiast who understands what a Commodore 64 is. It's just old. Let's say it's old. But so it's a part of it is just finding people, finding what they saved, looking in the unexpected places. But more often than not, it's print. It's things that are saved in print. Or one of the only screenshots I have of the gay and lesbian community forum on AOL comes from a promotional video AOL produced for God knows what reason, and somebody put it on the Internet Archive. And it just happened. It's like 2 seconds. And like that's what I've got. So sometimes it's just looking in the unexpected places, because unlike with print, there were not these formal archiving structures. So you will be looking in shareware CDs, you will be looking in newspapers, and or you will just be bothering elders and hoping they'll talk to you and give you their trash. All right, we got a couple. All right, so I'll let you pick. Because we got a couple. guess we'll go up and then sort of like curve down.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm just curious because you were talking about how we've kind of moved from more localized communities into, right, with the expansion of the internet and the World Wide Web into more broad spanning, right, by almost necessity of how it's been structured. And you see a lot of parallels in that in terms of like city building and all of that. I've seen a lot of comparisons between European and American communities and also like South American and how they structure their cities and their communities, where we are a lot more, the structure kind of prevents local communities from forming. And I'm wondering, of course, that's just a parallel. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on if it is even possible to go back to locally run internet communities like that, or if we've reached a point where we can support some level of that, but by necessity there's going to have to be broader spanning communities on the internet that maybe more have subsections of local groups, but are parts of larger organizations, and then beyond that, would going back to local communities be something achievable on an individual scale, right, on an individual local community scale? Or would that be something where we would need some sort of even government intervention or policy change to make something like that achievable?
That is a wonderful, very large question. And I think I tried really hard not to use the term Fediverse in this talk, which again, there'll be like 3 of you groaning when you hear that. But I think there is a part of this work that I don't talk about is the early BBS network FidoNet, which was founded by a queer anarchist skater punk. He literally designed it based on the principles of anarchy. It's this very interesting, weird network that I think gets at some of the same issues we have now. Because I think it is possible, but requires a rethinking of what is this thing for? Because so much of how we've understood post the dot-com crash has been about big spaces. The idea we would all, this is the, I won't call it X. It's not X, it's Twitter. Whatever. This is the Twitter problem of you take all the crabs and you put them in the bucket and you're like, let's see what happens. And it's like, sometimes the crabs can make their own little corners, but they're never really safe to themselves. There's no way for them to have any kind of privacy. So the system can do great things about connecting folks, but there's all these other hazards that make it equally unsafe. And I think this is a thing that this research being done by like Robert Gale at, I think he's now at Concordia University, and there's a book that just came out from University of California Press called Sharing Governance. It's open access. That is about governance online, where folks are starting to think about what these structures could look like, because a technical infrastructure like a decentralized protocol allows for small centralized servers, but individuals can connect to each other, but your host server is, in the case of some of them, they're run like cooperatives. So everyone involved gets a vote in some of the decisions. Yes, there is a governing board, but folks get to vote. And your funds, it's like any other co-op, your funds support the structure. So I think folks are starting to think about what these structures could be like, because that's one thing about the bulletin board system. They were not popular or well-known, so they worked out a lot of this stuff, but nobody really remembers that, because most Americans never used them, or if they heard of them, to be perfectly frank, they heard of them because mass media said they were full of porn. Like, that was the way they were branded. Like, they were these dirty mediums. But they also worked out a bunch of this stuff. And now we're essentially kind of rediscovering some of that work. So folks are really starting to think about what is it like now that we have the technical capacity to have where you can be interconnected but also decentralized. And so moderation authority can be local in a way that it wasn't before. Mm-hmm. All right. So we've had a hand for a while. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, you talked in the very beginning about going to college in Alabama, and I'm curious with the BBSs as kind of organizing spaces for like offline organization. If in your research you've found, or if you could speak more to like online spaces as like a replacement if there's like no gay bars in your town that you can invade. Like if that question makes sense, is like, did these BBSs or other places function as like a third place in the virtual world, in like spaces of more suppression of like LGBT community?
Oh yeah, they absolutely do. One of the so the Washington Post covers glib twice, and in the introduction, the introducing anecdote to one of these columns is a story with Bob, who is a graduate student at the University of Mississippi at the time, but who's a regular glib user, about how he cannot find any of this in Oxford, Mississippi. And I believe it, because it would have been 1993 then. Or he's struggling to find community, but glib becomes the place he finds people. And he describes how, like, these days when he's struggling, that's when he dials in. And he's like, sometimes I'm doing it every day, sometimes I can go a couple weeks, but that's where he's coming back to. And for folks who had no connection, like, that was key. Even if a board itself wasn't gay or lesbian, when they were connected to a network like FidoNet, which connected a bunch of them together, FidoNet, just like you see on Facebook, carries specific forums for gay topics. So you can still access some of that. So even if you can't find one that's specific to you, you can access networks of that other information. And it was absolutely true for folks who weren't connected otherwise, that like that was key for them, especially trans users. Because trans users, this is where the internet mattered the most. When you could not find a local community, that was where you found it until you could afford to go to some sort of in-person meetup. And so even though some of them were very locally based, they were still ways, if you had nothing else, you could still get connected. I guess over and then down. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I have more like a general question for up-to-date things. As somebody who tries to do a lot of community organizing and it's a little, not against, but has a hard time staying connected through online services and like spaces because of just what social media and like online spaces has become. I'm tending a lot more to try to do things in person and meeting in person, community spaces being like one-on-one. What would you say are some of the main ways that you've seen that people are nowadays using basically online spaces to reconnect back to that in-person setting, if any? And what are your recommendations to basically utilize the platforms that are available right now to reconnect people? And then with the understanding that some people won't actually be able to go to these in-person spaces, especially for like mobility reasons or for other safety reasons. What are some of the ways that you would say we could basically combine those two to make them work with each other and not against each other?
Oh, the last part of that question is a hard one. It's certainly true. If I think of a modern analog, this is the local Facebook group. Again, you can tell how old I am when I'm a local Facebook group, but it is sort of like having a place where you do some of that connection offline, or if the younger version of this being like the local Discord server. If you've got like a Discord server for the space, that's a way to stay connected, but often that space is then attached to a physical space. So I'm based in Spokane, Washington, so Odyssey Youth Movement is the LGBTQ essentially youth organization and center. And so like they have a physical center with regular meetups, but they also have a Discord server. And that's a way for them to stay connected to a bunch of members, especially for youth who are maybe live a half hour away, can't get in as often, but it's still local to them. Like it's still possible if they can get a ride to attend stuff. But that might not always be, but they can stay connected. So I think it's especially when any of these areas are attached to some sort of physical infrastructure is what makes it possible. I think the question of hybridity that is where some of this does break down, and there's not an easy answer. Because that is the thing about computers, especially early on when microcomputers in the 70s, one of the arguments for them was around the way in which they would increase access for people with disabilities in different ways. And so it was like a reason to laud them, but also, as with anything else, you idealize it and then you miss the ways in which these folks actually use the technology that doesn't fit your neat narratives, or the way in which the technology actually doesn't advantage them. And I think there is no good answer, but it is always a tension, and this is why I think having non-corporate options allows for someone to say, if I want to think about how I'm designing this, how am I building, say, rules and infrastructure and expectations, you're actually working with members, listening to what members need, as opposed to being like, well, this is industry standard. It's like, well, is what the industry does always best for people, or do we want to talk to the people, what do you need? Because maybe this is the, well, I think about teaching in the pandemic, the idea of hybrid teaching. I was terrible at it. I'm sure some of you are having flashbacks when I say something about hybrid classes. Some folks are really good at it, some are not. But with that move, there was never a conversation of, well, what does that actually look like? What are students, when it's only successful is when it's like, well, what do students actually need? And talking to them. And so I think if there will be spaces where it will work, even using existing tools, it's about talking to, well, what do folks need? What do you need to make this work for you so you can feel involved and engaged? And then trying to do your best to meet that instead of just being like, well, you know, we got all this other stuff to worry about. It's like, no, you need to center these needs first over the other stuff, because the other stuff will get itself handled. These folks often do not. I hope that is not always, I wouldn't say the best answer, but that's what I can think of. Yeah.
Hi. So I wanted to ask, so there's been a long history, of course, as I think a lot of us know, of conflating queerness with explicit and adult content. And it's been used for a long time for oppression and silencing of voices and stuff like that. But especially recently, I think on the internet, there's been a lot of discussion around this with, I think the big thing recently that was in your presentation was Tumblr got rid of that. And as someone who grew up on Tumblr and had that as sort of like a formative queer space, I just want to know, like, do you think that is that some things like that, and things like, I believe there was a sort of push for OnlyFans to get rid of their explicit content at one point, and I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on whether you think those are market manipulated or primarily sort of queer repression motivated, or some combination of the two, somewhere in between.
I think this is the market. I would put this as the market facilitating oppressive politics, in the sense that this is an argument I make at the end of my book that's basically like, whenever there are queer and trans users, they will always be a problem for a company. They will always be a problem because for some section of the people funding them, they will be associated with this. In the same way, when you see that Tumblr takedown, a part of that was around Apple standards, around what is appropriate content, and the threat that was made, well, we'll yank your app out of the App Store, and then where does all your money go? So all these market forces collude in particular ways. And we see this throughout the entire history of the internet, is in when we, I say we for queer and trans folks as a trans person, when we are there, we are always some sort of threat or problem to them, because at some point someone's going to be asking, but why are they here? Aren't they bad? And so I think this is why I really, even at the end of the book, I hammer into that ownership thing. Because when we own it, we make those determinations. When queer folks are in control of those decisions, they can set different standards, but there are also different options for how you interpret this. When a corporation is in control, they are going to lean toward what is the most market-friendly solution, because advertisers also hate this stuff. Like, this was always, so one of the things I talk about in the book is the history of AOL, and that, I promise I'm not going to summarize the whole chapter, but that until 1994, AOL banned use of the words transsexual and transvestite because of their association with adult content. Like, you were not allowed to say it. And if you said it too many times, your account was banned. And so there was a whole campaign led by trans users to get that overturned. But a reason I mentioned that is a part of that association was in their term, essentially how their moderators worked. Those terms equaled adult content. And a part of that concern was this was happening at the same moment when AOL is trying to convince all of America to sign up for America Online. I don't know how many of you lived through the AOL CD carpet bombing of the mid to late 1990s. That was a campaign waged against all of us. But like, they were trying to get Americans online. They're trying to get middle-class families. And a part of what you see about what is known as the cyber porn panic was all about the idea that kids could encounter adult content. And some of that adult content was queer people existing. So we will always be a problem for them when we are not in control. And so I think we see that with Tumblr. We see that over and over. And it is not thought of as oppression. It is thought of as market forces. But that is what it becomes. It becomes about, we need this off because our advertisers don't like it. It'll attract the wrong people. It is not what we want to accidentally come up. It's like, we will always be a problem unless we're in control and we get to set the standards for how this works. So I think we're about at one more? You feel it for one more? Yeah. And I think, people can talk to you outside. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's been really amazing to hear you speak and hear about all of your work. One thing that I've personally just experienced over the course of my lifetime being on the internet, specifically in relation to queerness and transness, is that it becoming seemingly more widespread, especially among young people and young adults, is that it's the result of some kind of social contagion, that people are learning about it through the internet and they are becoming trans or are thinking they're trans because it is cool and trendy. And that has unfortunately been happening in my lifetime as long as I can remember. And I wanted to know if that kind of similar phenomenon was something that you experienced in doing your research specifically on queer and trans spaces in the early days of the internet and online digital spaces.
So less on some of these early days, this is the thing I actually, I have a whole chapter of the book where I talk about it. Because this is the thing, you have this theme of social contagion, this idea of essentially what is a moral panic. This moral panic has happened over and over about the idea of what will our children learn from the internet. And one of the arguments I make looking at the historical data about trans youth in particular is if you say, if you read Jules Gill Peterson's wonderful book, Histories of the Transgender Child, we know what we would now call trans kids have existed for time immemorial. And they have been seeking care since Harry Benjamin first opened a clinic in the United States. They have always been here. But the thing is, they couldn't really talk to each other and they couldn't access the offline trans communities. So they say couldn't really go to a meeting. In fact, trans adults were afraid to interact with trans youth for fear they would be accused of child endangerment and be arrested. There were very strict rules some groups set around any kind of involvement with teenagers or youth. But once teens could talk with each other via computer, via like a BBS, and then later on, mostly, honestly, websites and IRC, a thing, again, 5 of you know what that is, but like through AIM, which more of you know what that is, once they could start to talk to each other, they could start to see each other. They could start to know that they were trans, and they could encounter this concept and think of themselves differently. And this is why I laugh when that comes up. And if I were teaching this class, I'd immediately Google Abigail Schreier's book with its horrifying cover. I don't suggest Googling it. Because that is where these ideas of social contagion come up. Is that just there's all these kids are becoming trans now. And my answer is just like, they were always there. It's just now they could talk to each other. They could start to talk to each other because they didn't have access to the existing community infrastructure. Same is true for all kinds of queerness. You couldn't talk to each other until the internet and talk safely unless you lived in a major city with a big youth group like Lyric in San Francisco. If you didn't have that, you didn't know where to go, but you could find somebody on the internet. And so they started talking to each other. You start to see, oh, it's okay that this is me. And you start to recognize, oh, there are other people like me. We can all have a space. We can identify like this. So this idea that it's a social contagion, which is like, no, they get to talk to each other, and you can't control how they talk to each other. That's what happened. So yeah, this is why the social contagion is bunk. It is a moral panic, and it is just youth get to have feelings and identities, and I'm sorry. And they get to self-determine, and folks don't like it, but that's how it works. And a part of how they get to self-determine is they get to encounter these concepts at earlier ages, see other youth who identify, have role models, and be like, that's me. And that is what's happening. There is no... Sorry, I'm entering into a rant. I'll stop now. We need to stop. Well, I'm just there is no social contagion. It's that youth can talk to each other now. And that makes the kind of folks who talk about social contagion uncomfortable because youth are not supposed to have the authority to define who they are. They're supposed to be told what they are, and they're just not supposed to change. All right, rant over. We should stop.